Good morning, WTOB listeners. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law. I'm Dylan Greenwood here with Jessica Armentrout, and today we're going to be talking about snooping on your spouse, how you can do it, how you can't do it, or how it would be unlawful to do it. Doesn't mean you can't.
No, that means you can't. It means we have to say you can't.
Yes. Yeah, but it could certainly be a situation where you're subjecting yourself to possible penalties by a court, civilly, criminally. There's a lot of different things that can happen. Oftentimes, I know, Jessica, you get called or somebody comes in the office, and usually where this comes from is that somebody thinks that their spouse is cheating on them.
Yes.
And they want to be able to show that, because there's actually a lot of implications for being able to show adultery within a marriage, of how it could affect somebody's divorce proceedings and stuff like that, right?
Or it can affect how it mostly affects, it does affect how alimony would play out. That's kind of the biggest thing that it applies towards. It's not really considered in custody cases too much unless your adultery was like somehow, I mean, I guess if you throw it in your kids' faces, that's bad, or you do it in a way that endangers the kids. Like, let's say you've got a bunch of not good people coming in and out of your house, or meeting them, or you're taking the kids with you to go meet them, or leaving the kids alone in the car when you meet them. Like, things, it can turn into your custody case, but the simple fact you're having an affair normally doesn't. But the simple fact that someone's having an affair definitely would have implications for an alimony or spousal support claim.
Right. And so with that and the implications that it has in civil cases, or in these divorce cases civilly, there can be huge implications for that, obviously. And so being able to credibly and lawfully find out that information can be a big deal.
Yes, because I've had people come in with information and they say, "Oh, I've got this on my spouse." I'm like, "Okay, well, how'd you get it?" That's the first question. How did you get this? Because depending on how you got it, we may not be able to use it, and you may be in trouble later if you end up having to produce something in some other fashion. It turns out you got it wrongfully. Like, if you got passwords because you sat there and guessed for a couple hours, that's obviously bad. If you got your password because they wrote it on a sticky note that was on the family computer and you just typed it, that's not going to be quite the same. And that's sort of where that disconnect is with people sometimes. You just, like I said, you just can't sit there and guess. But car tracking is a big, car trackers on their car is a big one.
We've both been involved in one of those cases.
If someone comes in and say, "Oh, I got all this information," track their car, it's like, well, who's the car titled to? Lots of other questions that go along with that. But if you have a licensed private investigator put a tracker on a car, then you're fine. Right. Assuming no domestic violence protective orders in place or anything.
So with a licensed private investigator, PI, what value can they provide in a situation like this? What can they do that the normal public cannot? Sure,
they can put the tracker on the car. They can follow. I mean, anybody can follow to an extent, but once you're asked kind of not to, or you're caught, then you might have an issue. The PI might have a little more leeway on those things. I mean, they're certainly following the person for a lawful purpose, and that kind of makes the difference there. I've recommended people hire a PI when they tell me that they're sure their spouse is cheating, but they don't have the evidence. I mean, years and years ago, I had someone hire a PI and put the tracker on the car before they separated. She was having an affair, and that was the black and white proof that we needed. One time, someone came to me and they already said they had good information, and I was skeptical because I didn't know how they got it. And they had a PI obtain it, so it was fine. And the level of information a PI gets just sort of depends on what's there. Like, sometimes you can have a really good PI following somebody, and that doesn't mean they catch them in the act every time.
Right.
I've seen a video that a PI took one time that, if it had been staged by a director, it could not have been any more clear that an affair was taking place. I mean, making out in front of the window, curtains blowing in the breeze, just a whole, so that's obviously pretty ironclad. But
looked like a rom-com.
It did. It looked like it was set up.
Yeah. The other thing that I think about value-wise that a PI can give to a case is credible testimony.
Yes.
If it gets to a hearing, there is kind of a little bit different, I guess, mindset with a court assessing evidence, kind of the implications of the testimony given, the credibility of the testimony given. Not to say that parties within a case aren't credible, they very well usually are and can be, but having a PI that's an independent party in all of this, I mean, they are hired by one of the parties.
Well, in that scenario, the PI is necessary because the person, let's say wife is trying to get spousal support and she's denying that she had an affair. Well, if she's going to admit she had an affair, you don't need the PI. But
Right.
if she's going to deny it, then you have to bring him in. And then he's really, at that point, it's not just that he's a credible third party, it's that he's impeaching her because she's lying. You know,
Right.
like that's, and here's the evidence that she's lying. And then that opens up a whole other host of issues.
I'm just saying, I think it's different than like you as one of the parties to the case presenting this evidence that you think is someone cheating versus a PI that says, yeah, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I observed, the other party go to this apartment that did not belong to them. They went in there. They were in there for an hour at a time. I watched them leave. I mean, that rings home.
Sure. And a lot of times all you can say is, well, I know that my spouse left at 11 o'clock at night and came back at 1:30. Does that 3 times a week. I don't know why or where she goes. Like, I think she's having an affair, but you can't prove it. PI was like, well, I followed her to this place. I saw her meet with this person. I saw, then they can just add a lot more.
And the other thing practically is for couples, if they have kids, it's a lot better to have a PI do these things and might be able to follow through, kind of like what you're getting at certain hours of the day or being away from the home for a certain amount of time. Whereas, you could stay at home with your kids or family or whatever else.
If your spouse is out sleeping around, somebody has to be home with the kids.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a big deal. It makes sense that a private investigator could really add a lot of value to these kinds of cases where you suspect that something is going on with a spouse. I know, kind of like what you were saying before, where you wonder about the way evidence was gathered. I know I personally had a case. It was actually a criminal case that at one time had a civil component to it, where the ex-spouse did not tell our client that she had activated Find My Friends on their iPhones together. And he did not know that his phone was being tracked by his spouse. And she tried to bring criminal charges against him for coming to a certain area because she said that she tracked his phone. Well, the only way that she could have gotten up and testified that she had tracked his phone was to herself admit to a crime on the stand. Because what that amounts to is cyber stalking. And that is a Class 2 misdemeanor here in North Carolina. And that is one of the potential implications that people have if they don't go about this lawfully. Cyber stalking is, using computers, electronic communication, email, electronic tracking devices like those GPS devices you talked about on a car, to be able to try and monitor someone's whereabouts or harass them online. There are a litany of potential issues there where all of a sudden, you think you're doing something to know what's going on, but what you're really doing is a serious misdemeanor here in North Carolina.
Another thing that a PI or the information they obtain can be used for is if in a custody case, after the case is resolved, even before, I guess, but before you can show the other parent kind of behaving badly with the children, leaving them alone at night, that running out at 11:30 to 1 o'clock. Well, now that you're separated, they live by themselves, so who's watching the kid? Yeah, things like that. Or if a party is not supposed to be in a certain place or doing something pursuant to your custody order, then that tracking can find them. Or if you suspect drug use, you can have a PI watch a house and see if they see such activity, or maybe smell marijuana, or whatever the case may be.
I know we've hired PIs in cases that figured out that the ex-spouse may have been soliciting themselves out. That it even goes that far. with what the implications are. So, I mean, that's, as you can see, we see a bit of everything here around town, all the things and the ways that people interact with one another. But, what you're getting at in child custody stuff, one of the things that always makes me very uncomfortable in those types of cases are when parents use the child to kind of be a spy on the other parent, to record things, report back what's going on in the other house. I mean, if you truly think that like some serious safety thing is happening and asking about that with your child, that's not, that's totally understandable. But some people actively use their child to know what's going on in the other household.
And that would probably be, if you could prove it, frowned upon, in a custody court. But it could be explicitly prohibited in your custody order. So
I was going to ask you about that.
Don't use your child as the PI. Just pay the money and do it.
Right.
Do it correctly. Also, your child may not be able to testify to what they learned anyways.
Right. And I was going to ask you about that because I know many child custody orders have in there that, you're supposed to promote a good relationship with the other parent, and you're not supposed to disparage the other parent, and all this stuff to kind of try to have as much of a healthy environment as possible, even though the two people that were together at one point are no longer together. And so it seems to me that if you're using a child or children to be able to do something like that, then that could fly in the face of that court order, and there could be penalties for that.
Sure. And also people ask with that, like, is a child allowed to record a conversation in the other person's house? So that's where we come into some of the criminal implications of, child recording something in the other person's house, you recording something in another person's house, you recording something in your own house, I guess that goes back to, and recording a conversation that you have with your child. North Carolina, as far as recording a conversation, you can record any conversation that you are part of. So, and you can give consent for your child to record a conversation, or not child to record a conversation, but to record a conversation that your child is part of. Like, let's say your child is talking to their dad and you're really worried about some of the stuff going on at dad's house, and dad, or the language dad uses, or whatever the case may be, and you record the conversation child has with father, that's okay. Just like it would be fine if you recorded that conversation, because you can give consent for the child to record, and you can give, and obviously if you're part of the conversation, like you and dad are talking one-on-one, then you can record that conversation. What you can't do is record conversations you're not part of, leave devices to record in various places that people don't know about, that kind of thing. Even if you're still married, still living in the same house, can't be just leaving recording devices around the house. So I think, doesn't that even have like a federal implication or something?
It sure does. There is a what's called a federal wiretapping statute, and that is something you've got to worry about, that one, and you've got to worry about North Carolina's one-party consent wiretapping law, which is what these sorts of things fall under, for whether or not you can record conversations and audio.
If you're just joining us here with For the Record with Greenwood Law, we were just talking about snooping on your spouse, and Dylan had just talked about federal wiretapping statute, and that's a little more common than people think, and it comes up kind of more in daily life with security systems, things like that, than people think. So can you tell us about how that works?
So anybody out there that's got ADT, CPI, wired something up in their home, there's a good possibility you've put a video recording device or some sort of surveillance camera, or even businesses that have surveillance cameras. You may be listening today and wondering, well, is that not a violation of the law in some way with some of the things that you are getting at? And it's not. And it's not as long as audio is not recorded at the same time. So per federal and state law, you're allowed to record video basically as surveillance as long as you are not concurrently recording audio. So I know I was a part of a case one time where, again, a spouse thought someone else was cheating and decided that they wanted to try to set up little cameras around to be able to do that. Well, basically it was a situation where there was a big concern because of the fact that there was audio as well that was also being recorded, and there was an in-depth conversation there with a lot of advice given specific to that case and that issue. But there was a big concern there because, as Jessica was getting to, you can't just kind of underhandedly set up all these little different surveillance devices around. And there are, videos on social media and TikTok and everything else that make it look like you can do that. But every state is different with how they approach wiretapping and surveillance. So you need to know your state-specific laws if you're living somewhere else besides North Carolina. But the federal law is in every state, and that's the one where you cannot record the audio at the same time. So that's how, like, Ring and ADT and CPI and all these places, they're not getting in trouble or getting you in trouble for recording video. Totally okay, but when you're recording both at the same time, that's a big issue. Because if you think about it, at that point, you're not an active party to the conversation. And so that's how it's different than audio recordings. When you are a party to the conversation, North Carolina being a one-party record state, you are there to give that consent or consent on behalf of a child, as Jessica was talking about. That is different because you are an active participant. So that's how you can get that audio together. You can record phone conversations. You can record your personal interactions with people on your phone, even if it's not over a phone call, when you are a party to the conversation.
What about like the Nanny Cams, things like that?
So Nanny Cams, again, as long as there's no audio associated with it, video, like as a surveillance thing, is okay. Mm-hmm. Typically speaking, the issue is when you're recording audio and video both.
What if you're recording audio and video with the Nanny Cam because you just said, well, I give consent for all my child's conversations to be recorded, and just kind of a blanket?
Yeah, and that might be a way to try to get around it. Mm-hmm. I do not know how a court would look on that. I think that constant surveilling might be looked at differently than like a one-off situation where you're giving consent to that specific conversation. Like the phone call with Dad we were talking about. Right. But I don't know the answer to that, and that is an excellent question and an excellent insight. And what my gut is telling me is that is going to be looked at differently state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, based off that interpretation. You were talking before about how it's generally lawful to follow someone around to figure out what's going on to an extent, but there is a cutoff, isn't there? Yes. And that's when, obviously it's good to have a private investigator involved, because there is kind of that cutoff, and that cutoff comes when it crosses into the level of stalking, because that is a violation of the law here in North Carolina. It's a serious one. It is an A1 misdemeanor. So our legislature has said that there's a difference between cyber stalking and actual physical stalking, in a sense that, well, obviously one is online versus one being in person, but it's implied that the one that is done in person is a more serious form of stalking, because it is an A1 punishable offense, and that's punishable of up to 150 days in jail. So obviously that's quite serious, whereas cyber stalking is only punishable up to 60 days in jail. And so stalking is something that actually, if you continue to do it, so if you do it on if you are convicted of stalking, a completely separate series of events occurs and you're convicted again of stalking, it can actually be a Class F felony at that point.
Is it the same person, or does it
matter? It does not have to be the same person. No. It's just a prior conviction of stalking in general. And the implication of why that amps up is, one, there are domestic violence kind of undercurrents typically with stalking. You see it a lot of times with jilted ex-lovers that aren't quite ready to give up a relationship or that become obsessed with somebody. And so basically the legislature said, well, if you didn't get the message the first go around, you're definitely going to get the message the second go around. And it doesn't have to necessarily be with the same person, because at this point you should be aware of what actually constitutes stalking.
And the problem is with your behavior, and that's what they're trying to correct.
Right, because it isn't just necessarily enough that you follow someone around is automatically going to be stalking. That's not it. You have to do so in a way that your following actually harasses another person. It's intended to place them in fear of their safety. It causes the other person substantial emotional distress or fear of like bodily injury, or it engages in a course of conduct directed at a specific person, knowing that that course of conduct or harassment would cause a reasonable person to fear or have emotional distress. And so obviously that runs a full gamut of potential issues. But the thing about stalking that we look at a lot of times is we see it where someone alleges stalking because one time something happened that bothered them. And they're like, this really freaked me out. Well, that can be perfectly valid. That person's feelings, absolutely valid. The situation, not great. But that's not stalking, because it has to be on at least twice, usually 3 times, something happening before stalking actually takes place. And that can be really disturbing to some people, because they're like, well, what do you mean I have to go through this on more than one occasion before I can bring this action? Well, yeah, because the implication in stalking is that it's more than one time. It
happens all the time.
Yeah. Right. And there are some people out there who have been legitimately stalked and cyber stalked, and it is perfectly valid, but that one-off instance, not valid at all.
Or at least not enough to constitute a crime.
Typically.
It may not make you feel better, but it's the way the court system might look at it.
At least as it is with stalking. And so when a court, they look at were you in the physical presence of another person? Did you follow them? Did you monitor them? Did you surveil them? Did you threaten them in any way? Did you like constantly communicate certain things to them? Or did you interfere with their property or personal property in some way? So that's how stalking can really affect. The other thing that can happen as a potential criminal liability when it comes to issues surrounding snooping on your spouse is trespassing. It's kind of glossed over a little bit, but trespassing can either be a class 3 misdemeanor or a class 1 misdemeanor, depending upon whether or not you've been informed to not be on that property before. So if you are trespassing on someone else's property, that can be a violation of the law as well.
Right, and that's where you'd want to have the PI out there taking the pictures and not you sitting.
Right, exactly.
So we talked earlier in the show about proving an affair in the course of an alimony claim, but sometimes the torts of alienation of affection and criminal conversation, which is that's the sex part of alienation of affection. Alienation of affection is just ruining the marriage. Anyone can do that. Well, not anyone, but certain people can do that didn't have sex with your spouse. But the PI that we talked about earlier, that even if alimony is not an issue in your case, perhaps alienation of affection or criminal conversation is. And the PI doesn't necessarily have to catch your spouse in the act, or you. I mean, you don't have to catch them in the act, but you might need to catch them being with the other person, maybe behind closed doors for an extended period of time, and you need to know that they had either a serious friendship or exchanged some messages that were inappropriate, or at least alluded to the fact that they might do these things with one another. Just being alone together is not gonna cut it. You need to know that there is something sexual going on to some other way, and then you catch them alone together. And so whether you do that or a PI does that, inclination and opportunity can get you there, and you can do all the things we discussed to help you get to those things, as long as they're within the bounds of the law.
Right. And at that point, what you would be doing is suing the person that they were cheating on you with.
You're not suing your spouse at that point or getting anything in particular from your spouse. It's the person they were seeing.
Right. Well, WTOB listeners, thank you for joining us here today on For the Record with Greenwood Law as we bring you another episode to inform you about your rights and the things that you can and cannot do here in the state of North Carolina. And, these are some questions that get brought up a lot with us because, as you can probably well guess, this is an emotional topic, especially, anything involving the heart or a marriage and the implications it has with a family. I think what we can take away from all this is it's usually better to leave it to a professional. There are some things you can do lawfully, but at the end of the day, probably better left to a professional. That being said, before you go, do not forget the Greenwood Law Bill of Rights. And that's first and foremost, I will not represent myself in a court of law. Second, I will not do law enforcement's job for them. 3, I will not make statements when stopped by law enforcement. 4, I will not consent to searches when stopped by law enforcement. And 5, I will not be my own star witness for the prosecution. It's not a crime to know and assert your rights. Stay safe out there, WTOB listeners. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law, signing off.